Today's scripture reading is an odd one in that we hear that God, after 6 days of creating, decided to rest. So God doesn't need a break. So why does the Bible say that God needs a rest? Well, it's interesting, in 20th century theology, a lot of people would say that God's been resting ever since the seventh day of creation. Liberal theology, there's a strain of it that says that our God is a weak God. God set up the physics of the universe and then just sat back and has been watching nature run ever since. A clockwork universe, as they say. And so this school of theology says that if you want to get something from God, you know what? You're really on your own, because God's not going to intervene into human affairs to change anything. That is not at all the philosophy that motivated the writing of today's scripture. Those folks believed that God was an interventionist God. They believed that no baby was born without God participating in it. No battle was won or lost without one of the gods having taken a side. And for the Jews, they believed that God was always involved in the major events of their lives. And of course, we see this no more plainly in the Bible than in the story of what happened to the ancient Israelites when they went to Egypt. Joseph brings down his brothers during a famine. They stay. Things are going well at first, but then they become enslaved, and eventually Moses meets God in the burning bush, and God says, I want my people to be free, and gives Moses the power to wreak all sorts of havoc on the Pharaoh and the Egyptians to get the people free. This is God intervening in human history in a very, very explicit way, with animals raining down from the heavens, rivers turning to blood, all sorts of huge disasters, locusts. There's nothing subtle about what God does for the Israelites to get them out of Egypt. And once he gets them out, and they're in the desert, God gives them the 10 Commandments. And we heard the 4th commandment today in the reading that Kwaku read for us. You will take the 7th day off. Not just you, but everybody in your household. If you've got slaves, they get the day off. If you've got guests from out of town, they get the day off. Even your oxen and your donkey, they get the day off. Everybody in your household gets the day off. That idea, of course, is being carried forward into the present. Even if you have any friends who are Orthodox Jews, you know that the Sabbath day, which is a Saturday for them, is a very different day than the days of the rest of the week. Starting Friday night, things change. You can't press buttons and do work for 24 hours. So if you want to have a hot meal with your family on Sabbath Saturday, if you're an Orthodox Jew, you got to turn on the oven before Friday night at sundown so that there'll be an oven already on that you can put your food into. In some buildings, the elevators are programmed so that they stop at every floor so that no one has to press a button on the Sabbath. So people take this very, very seriously. Among Christians, of course, our Sabbath day is Sunday, and we used to take that very, very seriously in terms of not doing work. We still don't go to the office on Sundays, which is a blessing. But for a long time, all the shops were closed on Sundays. You couldn't go shopping. And older people have told me that Toronto was a very, very boring place up until around the 1950s, because it was only in the 50s that professional sports was able to be played on a Sunday. There wasn't a lot to do in Toronto the good on a Sunday, and so people often went to church twice, once in the morning and once in the afternoon or evening. But this too has changed. In 1992, Bob Rae's NDP government said, okay, you know what? Let's let the stores open on Sundays. And ever since then, Sunday has become more and more like the rest of the week. We're not resting much on our Sabbath, and most Christians aren't too worried about that. If you answer an email on a Sunday, or you do a little bit of office work, or you go to a game, you're not worried about getting in trouble with God for that. And that's fine. But it all depends on how you define trouble, doesn't it? In our day and age, it's getting harder and harder to tell any day of the week from the rest. The pandemic did not help with this, especially among people who make more money. They were the ones who were able to say, no, actually, I'd like to have my office at home. So people find that, their study is their office 7 days a week. And they can always go in there and just, finish an email or check to see how things are going work-wise. And if you want to go shopping, it's true that, at 2 o'clock in the morning on a Wednesday, there's not a lot of stores to go shopping in, but the internet is always open. Imagine going online at 2 o'clock in the morning and going to Amazon and wanting to order something and seeing a sign, closed until 9 a.m. It's not going to happen, right? The internet is always on and is always waiting for us. Technology has made it so that every day is like every other day. We're always available for work. We could always be shopping. But that's not the way it was supposed to be. And I'm not speaking religiously here. I'm speaking in terms of secular terms. Back in the early 20th century, capitalism basically made an offer to workers and said, listen, we would like to introduce technology into your workplace as well as the home in the interest of saving you time. We're going to give you labor-saving technologies, which will mean that you won't have to work as hard. And they put out advertisements about this. Let's see a few. Here's one. So up-to-date labor-saving technology will take the drudgery out of keeping store records. So the cashier's machine was offered as a way of saving time. And at home, it was no different. All you have to do is set the dial and sit back and read magazines, and you'll have all the time in the world, because instead of washing clothes by hand and putting them up on the clothesline, you've got a couple of machines who will do that work. And of course, that's true. Not many of us would want to go back to the old washboard thing with clothing, right? And I also came across a funny ad of a fax machine saying, this is going to save you so much time. Well, they did, right? All these technologies did save us time. My father was a stockbroker, and he was an analyst because he was formerly an engineer, and he used to write reports on which companies were worth investing in because he understood how chemical plants worked. And the way he wrote his reports was he would write them out by hand on foolscap paper, hand them to his secretary. She would sit down, read his terrible handwriting, and write it up, type it up, and then hand it back to him. And he would take a look, and he would scribble all over it, making revisions, changing ideas, and so forth, hand it back to the secretary. She would write it all up, hand it back to him, and it went to back and forth and back and forth. The amount of time it took to write that report. Whereas now, of course, someone with his job would just sit down at a word processor and write the report himself or herself. And it would be done. Right? Things have gotten much, much more efficient. But since 1960, the number of hours which people work full-time has not changed hardly at all. By 1960, the 40-hour work week had been put in place, and it hasn't budged. And since 1960, we've seen 60 years of astonishing technological progress. We've had the invention of computers, fax machines, word processors, the internet, robotics, artificial intelligence, and we're still working 40 hours a week. And not only do we work exactly the same amount of time as we did back in 1960, but back then, usually, in most households, there was only one person working for wages. And they were able to have a car and a house and get along and feed themselves and have a nice middle-class lifestyle. Now it generally takes at least two people working full-time 40 hours a week to have that house and a car and that lifestyle. Something has gone missing along the way. Technology was supposed to deliver rest, but that doesn't seem to be the way that it has turned out. Every time we become more efficient, we found more work to do, and so we're still working the same amount of hours. And that has an impact on the kind of rest that we get. Let's spin back a few hundred years. If you were living in, say, the 1400s, and it was bedtime, what would happen? Well, you've worked hard on the farm all day long. The cows and the oxen are still in your house because that's where they were, so they're settling down for the night. The sun has gone down. It's time for sleep. So, you've got oil lamps and stuff, but that's expensive. So after an hour or so, once it's dark, you go to bed. You go to sleep. You have your first sleep. Because back then they talked in terms of first sleep and second sleep. First sleep took you to about midnight. You'd wake up spontaneously, no alarm clocks back then. You'd wake up spontaneously, and it was customary for people to wake up for an hour or two around midnight. They would write letters, they would talk to each other, people would pray. In the Bible, you often read, I pray to you at midnight. It's not because they were getting up on purpose. It was because they just naturally woke up around midnight, because after a 4-hour sleep cycle, you tended to wake up. And so you'd do some stuff, people would make love then. It was just sort of a nice quiet time, and apparently some people sort of experience a sort of meditative state during those twilight hours around midnight. And then you go back to sleep for your second sleep, and you sleep until the sun came up. People got a lot of good sleep back then. Spin forward to now, however, and scientists tell us that we should get between 7 to 9 hours sleep. But not many of us get it. About 35% of us, 35% of U.S. adults, according to the Center for Disease Control, do not get 7 hours sleep. That's like 1/3 of the workforce is sleep deprived most of the time. That's not good for concentration at work, although it does explain the popularity of coffee and Starbucks and all those other coffee outlets. And it's not good for your physical health either. Sleep is where your body repairs itself. So if you're not getting enough sleep, you're not giving your body a chance to repair itself. And that can lead to chronic problems. If you feel like you are depressed and you go to the doctor, the first question they'll ask is, how are you sleeping? Because people who don't get a good night's sleep will feel so dragged out that it often manifests as depression or as feelings which seem like depression. And it's not just working people who are suffering from this. Retired people as well are increasingly sleep deprived. And it may seem odd. I mean, they don't have a clock to punch, so why are they getting too little sleep? Well, studies have found that as you age, your circadian rhythms change, and the hour at which you wake up tends to get earlier. A lot of older people wake up around 5 or 6 in the morning, which would be fine if they went to bed earlier, but often they don't. They've had a lifetime of staying up until the 11 o'clock news, so they stay up late, and then they find that they can't sleep past 5 or 6, so maybe they have a nap in the afternoon, or maybe they just walk around tired all the time. And part of the reason you may be tired, whether you're a working person or whether you're retired, is, of course, our digital devices are really good at keeping us awake. The kids, if you've got any kids who like computer games, you'll know the phenomenon of staying up till 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning so that you can finish this game, or I was on such a roll, I'm going to keep going. Not good for your rest. But also, reading on the Kindle or checking the computer till 11 o'clock, the blue light that comes from our computerized devices tells our brains, oh, it's still daylight outside. What you need is the orange light of sundown and natural fires, fires in the fireplace. That's the signal to our brains, oh, it must be nighttime, let's get drowsy. So all sorts of things have conspired to keep us awake. We are not resting very well in the 20th century and the 21st. In the Genesis account that we heard, where the seventh day is the day of rest for God, that account was written at a really stressful time for the ancient Israelites. It was written after they had been taken captive by the Babylonian Empire. The Babylonians were the great world empire of their day, and they had swept into Israel, surrounded Jerusalem, laid siege to it for many months, and then finally broken through the walls, taken over the city, burnt the temple to the ground, stolen all of its treasure, and took the royal family and all the treasure back to Babylon. And Babylon is about 30 miles outside of what is now Baghdad in Iraq. During the Babylonian captivity, the Jews got to know the ways of the Babylonians because they were there for 70 years. The Babylonians were pagans. So pagans believe in sacred space, right? There's a grove that's sacred because there's some sort of God in there. There's sacred rivers, there's sacred springs. And in their cities, like Babylon, they had these gigantic step pyramids called ziggurats. And inside of them, there were idols built of their wood on the inside, but then covered in gold and silver. And they stood like 20 and 30 feet tall. They were extraordinarily imposing. And priests would spend all day long feeding them. Like they had 4 meals a day. They would be fed with food just because they needed these gods, who they believed really were there in person inside these temples. They needed the gods to be happy, or else bad things would happen to the empire. Okay, so the Jews see all of this and go, no, that's a terrible way of seeing this. No. It's not space that is sacred. It's time. The Jews had seen their sacred temple destroyed by the Babylonians, so they said, no more. When we hear the Genesis account of the first 6 days of creation, not once are we told, and the plants were holy, or, and the sea is holy. No. There are no holy places at all in the first 6 days of creation. What's holy is the 7th day. The 7th day is holy. It's like a temple, but it's a temple in time. Time itself becomes sacred. Why? Why would God do this? Why would God say it's so important to have a day of rest after 6 days of creation? Well, it's because it's a philosophical statement about how you determine meaning. How do you know if something's meaningful? Well, God decided creation itself isn't meaningful until I stop creating and I can sit back and look at it and ponder what I did. Get some perspective on it. It's like a sentence. If a sentence doesn't have a period, how do you know what it means? It just keeps going on and on and on with words. You keep waiting for the verb. You keep waiting for it to end. But if it doesn't end, you don't know what it means. Another example. Imagine you have a job that you do not like. You used to like it, but you don't like it anymore. So in the morning, you find it hard to get up and go to work. And when you're at work, you can't wait for it to be 5 o'clock so you can leave. How do you know the meaning of why you're not happy at work? Well, you'll probably compare this job with other jobs you've had in the past. You might compare the job with a job that you might have in the future. Maybe I don't like being a teacher. Maybe I'd prefer to be a carpenter. Maybe I'd prefer to be an accountant. Or you might say, you know what? I'm not too picky about what kind of job I have, but I need to make more money because I want to save up for a cottage, or I want to save up for a car, or I want to be able to do more fun things on my weekends. In each case, the way you evaluate whether your job is meaningful is by comparing it to something that isn't your job. That's how meaning works. You have to change the frame of reference to know what anything means. Is this a good job or a bad job? Compare it to other jobs. Compare it to what you want to do in the rest of your life, and you'll be able to figure out the meaning of this job. That's what God's doing with the 7th day of creation. God's saying, there's no way to know what creation means unless you can step back from it, unless you can get some perspective on it, unless you can take a rest from it and look at it carefully. So if that's how meaning is created, how do we create meaning in our lives? How do you know that your life is going okay? And that's a question often that, people who retire have to really struggle with. Because in our culture, your meaning, your purpose is to work. Whether it's raising children or working for money in a job, we assume that meaningful life is workful life. But when you retire, suddenly you're in this situation where, well, I've got my pension, but I'm not punching the clock anywhere anymore. So what does my life mean? Who am I separate from my job? Now, I know a lot of people have jobs that are, labors of love. But eventually, when that work ends, you're still here and the job isn't. So who are you? retirement can be seen as a Sabbath period in your life where you get a chance to stand back from the thing that kept you so busy, raising a family, having a job, and go, who am I? What am I really about? And it can take a while to figure that out. This is the time where you get to actually think through, what do I really love in this life? What do I want to do with my time? Do I want to volunteer? Do I want to help others? Do I want to get more into art? Like, who am I really beyond just making money? And churches are a wonderful place to explore that, because this is kind of a sandbox of volunteering opportunities. You want to start a committee? Just let us know. I'd be astonished if we said no. If you want to get some people together to do a short-term project, we have all the tools for that. We have access to hundreds of people. We have connections throughout the entire community. You can actually live out your passions through a church in a way which is harder to do with your condo board. We're just a different kind of institution. And we're here because we pause every week to think about how our lives collectively fit into this cosmic context, from the beginning of time to the end. And we don't just think about it morally, right? We're also talking about climate change, and we're trying to put our lives collectively into context. That's what this pause is for. And we do it in song, and we do it in word, and we do it in silence. And it's true, there's not as many people here as there used to be. That is true. There's more empty seats than there used to be. But is that surprising in a society that is so determined to just keep going and never stop to ask why? We're the folks who stop to ask why. And frankly, the world needs more of us. And maybe they will get more of us. As things get scarier, perhaps more people will say, we should be thinking this through more. And maybe some of them will come to us. Whether they do or not, it's hard to tell. We don't have a crystal ball. But we should never underestimate the importance of what we do here when we pause and ask why. What does it all mean? That's what we do here on Sundays. And for those who are still working and who are really, really busy, and you're taking kids to games, and everything, it seems like every minute of your life is accounted for, maybe you'll need to sort of build in some pause into your life. Actually, set aside some time in your busy week. Maybe even make it mandatory. Time off just to think. Turn off the machines and just think and wonder and rest. God did that. Even God did that. Took the seventh day off. Worked for God. Maybe it'll work for you. Amen.